everyone. Thank you guys also. Thank you guys all so much for being here. I know it looks like I'm talking into a mic. This is actually just a mic for our camera back here. We are filming this so that this can be posted online on YouTube later on. But before our talk, I wanted to just let you guys know what all is happening in May. We have a long list of things that are coming up. On May 2nd, it is the National Day of Reason. And now we do blood drives every single month. We alternate between the east side and here in the Seattle area. But the date got moved from May just so it could be on the National Day of Reason. And that location, the blood drive, is going to be on or at the Bellevue Puget Sound Blood Center. And then next is going to be May 4th. That is I believe that's a Saturday. That's going to be, we're going to be at Food Lifeline. We're doing this every other month. We're helping out Food Lifeline. They're a wonderful organization. What they do is they basically take in food from all different big companies, Safeway, Whole Foods, PCC, big farm co-ops that have potatoes that are the wrong size, wrong shape for stores, but they're perfectly good to eat. So they pay just for the shipping to get things in, and then they repackage things and send them out to different food banks all throughout the Northwest. And so they just need volunteers to help with that process. So we've signed up to work with them every other month, and our next date again is May 4th. And then we're also the first meeting of our lobby team. We just put together a lobby team. We're going to be basically dealing with issues that we want to talk to our state representatives about. One of the key things we're concerned about right now is the religious Catholic takeover of secular hospitals. So we're going to be that's going to be one of the primary issues that we're going to start off talking about. But it's not the only. There are plenty of other secular issues that our community care about that we want to have a voice for our representatives and connect with them. So if you're interested in joining us and joining the lobby team, our first meeting is going to be Wednesday, May 8th at the Blue Star Cafe and Pub. That's in the Wallingford neighborhood, and that's going to be at 7 o'clock. Next, after that, the May 12th is our book club, also going to be at the Blue Star Cafe. Nickeled and Dimed is the book that we're going to be reading. That meeting is on Sunday at 6 o'clock, May 12th. And we have so many other things on the calendar. I think the next one is May 16th. This is I mentioned just a moment ago about the issue with Catholic takeovers of secular hospitals. So we're not the only ones concerned about this. The Americans United is hosting an event with the ACLU on May 16th. And it's a presentation dealing with that specific issue, and that's going to be at the Capitol Hill Library at 6 p.m. And the next big event after that is the University District Street Fair. We're going to have a booth there. We hope you're going to come see us. We're actually going to be located on University Way this year. Come visit us. Come say hi. Buy some buttons. Buy some swag. Ask an atheist. Always available for questions there. And also, if you're interested in volunteering, we're looking for volunteers to be helping with answering questions that people might have, dispelling myths that people have about atheists. And I think that's everything for May. May is a very busy month, but June's going to be even busier. So if you're interested in finding out, all of these things are going to be posted. The best place to find out find these different events is on our meetup page, meetup.com/Seattle Atheists. You can also find us on Facebook. You can go to our website, seattleatheist.org. And I think that's everything. I hope I'm not leaving anything out. Vicki will tell me if I am, hopefully. But I'm gonna switch things over and let our presenter speak.
Quite all right. Thanks, Erica. I appreciate that. I'm John Geisheker. I'm the executive director and general counsel for Doctors Opposing Circumcision, and I'll give you a little history of that in a second. I want to thank you all for coming out on a warm day when it would have been very tempting to sit in your back lawn and drink a beer, I'm sure. And I really appreciate your being here. So this is an action-packed, totally content-jammed presentation I have here. It's a compendium of several others I've done in the past on different occasions here and overseas. I've done things on religious belief and healthcare for children. In other words, children who don't get healthcare because their parents are religious. I've done things on the medical aspects of circumcision. I've also done things on the legal and human rights aspect of circumcision. And so this is a sort of I don't know, could we call it John's best hits? This is my wife, Michelle. We'll see. We'll let you judge whether it's a hit or not. Okay, let's get rolling. Well, first, a fascinating factoid. Did you see that I used this symbol for medicine? It's actually not the symbol of medicine. It's the symbol of commerce. In fact, it's actually the symbol of theft and deception. according to ancient Greek and Roman mythology. This is the actual symbol of medicine. It's called the rod of Asclepius. And a lot of medical organizations in the States use this one. In other words, they're correct. And a lot use this one. And I'll leave you to think about the commercial irony of the American medical care system as you consider their use of symbolism. All right, well, here's a little overview of what we're going to do today. I'll do the introduction to, whoops, sorry about that. Introduction to Doc, something about memes. Those of you who've read your Richard Dawkins, you know what memes are, and I'll mention it quickly. And something on religion. I'm not going to do a lot on religion, you'd be surprised, and I'll tell you why. Do something about the prevalence of circumcision in our culture. It's very much an Anglophone phenomenon. It's Anglophone or religious. There are not a lot of other people who do it. I mean, there are like Philippines and so forth, and there are reasons for that. But it's very much an Anglophone tradition. Something on the anatomy, which is going to be fairly brutal and straightforward, and I have been doing this for so long, I've sort of forgotten that when you talk about genitalia, you're treading on a very delicate part of the cultural secrets that we all maintain. But shall I see you in the back, you want me to go for it, right? Just go for it, okay? That's great. We'll do something on the results of circumcision, which is where the anatomy gets brutal. And then a little tiny course on Bioethics 101. I can make a bioethicist out of you, I swear, in 15 minutes. Using this or any other topic, actually. It's rather an interesting part of medicine and the law. Well, this is George Denistoun. I need to introduce him. I hoped he'd be here today. He couldn't make it. But he was the founder of DOC years ago. He was a clinical professor of family practice medicine at UW for many, many years. He's now retired. But this is what we do at DOC. I track PFFR incidents. You'll learn more about this in a second. It's premature forcible foreskin retraction. And to zip ahead, I will tell you that if you have an intact boy, he could be expected not to see the little fireman's hat on his penis for up to 10 years. And sometimes it's common for them not to be able to see it till they're 14 or 15. It is not a problem. It's a natural membrane, and we'll talk more about that in a second. We go to medical conventions and baby fairs, and I've done La Leche League and gentle birth and water birth and all kinds of things. We liaise with our colleagues in Europe and Australia who think that Americans are kind of crazy on this subject, quite frankly. I represent COs, conscientious objectors, to doing any kind of genital surgery that the child doesn't need. So I get contacted by RNs and MDs, usually residents, who are under pressure to do circumcisions and do not wish to do so. I give restoration advice to men who want to do non-surgical restoration of their foreskin, and yes, it is possible. It's not a perfect replacement, but it's awfully good. I do press outreach, of course. I give legal advice. I advise lawyers in injury cases and provide expert witnesses from my DOC members as needed. So a couple other related things. I also travel overseas, and I want to introduce you to Efua Dorkanu and Comfort Momo, who are two of the most famous campaigners against female genital mutilation in the United Kingdom, and who do a lot of outreach into. Efua is from Kenya, and Comfort is, I believe, from. Oh, I've forgotten. I shouldn't say. But I appeared with them at the University of Kiel, England, a couple of years ago on the subject of FGM. And you might think FGM, I mean, DOC is opposed to genital surgeries to children that are not necessary, right? FGM is definitely in there, and there are a bunch of other ones you probably don't want to even know about, frankly. But we have a 10,000 strong Somali community here, and of course that was a very strong tradition, millennial old in their culture, and it still is, you know, they're attempting to damp it down themselves, but there obviously still are occasions where it goes on. So I was reporting to the University of Kiel about our incidents here. And just on a quick aside, there was actually a movement here which makes Seattle unique among doctors who wish to do a female genital cutting version that would satisfy the parents and satisfy the culture, and they wanted to basically medicalize it. In other words, make it a billable procedure that you would do to Somali girls. And of course, there was a huge outcry in the Seattle community, and that went away fast, and dang, it should have too, you got to admit. Anyway, there are other things that we worry about. We've actually had kids who had just brutal surgeries here in town because they're retarded and their parents don't want them to grow up or to reproduce or to have periods. So we're opposed to any genital tampering, basically, of children without their permission and for no good reason. Now, a quick concept, and many of you are well-read enough, being sort of skeptical types, I'm guessing, that you know this, perhaps you know this rule: a fish does not know about the water. The hardest thing to understand is your own culture. because your own culture so surrounds you and so encapsulates you all day long, 24-hour, 24/7, that it's very hard to get a perspective on it and see that this could be very unusual. Well, let me tell you, I'm a New Zealander by birth. I came to the United States when I was 5. And in my native land, they gave up circumcision completely, 40 years ago. Yet their children have universal health care and are healthier than our children. And so it can't be said that it can't be got rid of, that cultures can't change. Yet it still lingers in American culture as if it were necessary, and of course, it isn't. So here's, those of you who read your Richard Dawkins will know the meme, right? A meme is a unit of culture transmitted from person to person without much inquiry into its truth or utility. In other words, it's just something you say and that other people believe, and it seems to be okay, we all agree on it, and so we'll stick there. A memeplex is an intersecting and interconnected series of memes that help to feed and sustain the main meme. And circumcision is probably one of the most complicated ones we have. It is so fraught with history and religion and class and culture and race and the needs of communities and medicine, and you can see them all here. And this, by the way, is compliments of a friend of mine in New Zealand, a fellow Kiwi, Hugh Young, who lives in Wellington, who runs a wonderful website I urge you to go to if you have an interest in this topic, called Circumcisions. It's a little jam-packed these days, but it's very, very, very interesting and well thought out and very comprehensive. All right. I'm not going to have a lot to say about religion. I mean, I know that's sort of ironic. By the way, were you all in church this morning? I'm looking around. I'm just wondering why we're having this on a Sunday afternoon. That's because we had to save Sunday morning, right? All right. There are religions involved in circumcision. There's no doubt about it. I mean, probably the most famous is Judaism. A little less famous if you don't know about this topic is Coptic Christians. And there are now fundamentalist Christians who are doing home circumcisions because they have swung back into the Old Testament, and they're brutal. And of course, some of them are in jail and some of them aren't, and we don't know how much of it goes on. It's frankly very much sub rosa. The Muslim tradition is a little tricky because it's not really part of their religion. It's mentioned in a hadith, the comments on the Quran, but it is not part of their religion. It's not a religious mandate. Muslims will argue for it, but their argument gets really thin real fast because it's really cultural. It's cultural in the way that Aboriginal circumcisions are cultural, or Polynesian circumcisions, Filipino, etc. Judaism is the one, of course, it's the tail that wags the dog, especially in this country. You have to remember, though, the Jews make up 2% of the US population, and most of them, probably 75 to 80%, will have their child circumcised on day 2 or 3 of his birth, without even bothering with the 8th day requirement, or the prayers, or the sendak, or the moil, because it's expensive to do it. You can't bring them back to the hospital 8 days later. That's a second admission. That would cost a bundle. So basically, because they're mostly secular, they don't bother with the ceremony. And yet, when I'm interviewed on this subject, of course, the interview always says, well, what about the Jews? Well, what about them? They make up 2% of the US population. The numbers who would do it always are tiny, a tiny percentage of a 2%. So really, 99.9% of the circumcisions in the US have absolutely nothing to do with religion. They're entirely embedded in our culture and our medical aspects. It's actually about all I have to say about the religious aspects of it. It's an entirely different topic. You could spend an easy 2-3 hours lecturing on it and its little bits and pieces. I will tell you quickly that the vice president of DOC is an observant Jew who's fully restored his foreskin, who runs a website called Brit Shalom, which is a ceremony that he and a whole group of rabbis who subscribe to his system will perform on request. It's a blessing ceremony for the boy. Nothing gets cut off. A little wine is drunk, some hors d'oeuvres, and the kid gets off scot-free. And many rabbis will still let the child come to go to yeshiva and have a bar mitzvah, etc. So it's gaining ground, not fast. All right, trivia question. This is a fun one for you. If you know the answer to this, don't blurt it out because it is kind of fun. So just think about it for a second. But if you don't know, it'll cause a little puzzle. But the puzzle will come to you as we go on. There is a connection between breakfast cereals and circumcision. There definitely is. Okay, the world prevalence of medical routine infant circumcision can be seen on this map real simply. It never happened in almost all of Europe, Russia, and Asia, South America, or Central America. Now, it gets trickier in other places. The problem is that it's an Anglophone phenomena. The medical version is an Anglophone phenomena invented in about the 1860s and has been with various Anglophone countries. And of course, I'm from New Zealand, which always, by the way, is in the lower right-hand corner where it says printed in USA on maps. We just don't get treated well. Kiwis don't. But it infected New Zealand, Australia, to a limited extent parts of South Africa, other English colonies, and especially the US. And oddly enough, it infected South Korea. Does anyone care to guess how the South Koreans came up with circumcision? The Korean War, absolutely. The MASH doctors, who were originally heroes of mine, apparently introduced circumcision, and the locals took it up as, in a very Confucian way. They imposed it, saying this was a cleanliness thing. You could be as clean and as healthy as an American if you were circumcised. And today, the rate there is like in the 90s, really one of the highest in the world. Now, medicalized circumcision in the US is a very big industry. It's $1.5 billion industry, at least $1.5 billion. This is what we know about. There's 1 million every year. Whoops, sorry. Let me back up here for a second. There's a million every year, one every 29 seconds or so. About 2/3 get no anesthesia whatsoever, even though medical societies are constantly saying, oh, that's important, but nobody does it. The tissue is sold. Oprah Winfrey pushes a skin cream that's made from foreskins. The complication rate is, according to the medical people, 1%. According to people I know and are published on this, 55%. And according to doctors opposing circumcision, 100%, because the child has lost a functional part for no good reason. And so that is itself a complication, of course. 71% of boys, even done typically, will get adhesions that require further medical care. And the situation is completely unregulated, and later on, if we get enough time, I'll show you. I just got an article published in a magazine called New Male Studies, called The Completely Unregulated Practice of Male Circumcision. And I detail very straightforwardly, I think, how anyone could do it. Everyone in this room can do a circumcision. You need no medical training. You can find the tools on eBay. There is no law that says you can't. The child is basically in your hands for whatever you wish to do. By the way, I'm very proud of the fact that I represented, with a team of lawyers, I hired a team of lawyers, the boy named Bolt, who was 14 years old and facing a circumcision he didn't want because his father had converted to Judaism. It took us 5 years of litigation to get that to the United States Supreme Court, who turned it down. And it came back, and the child by then was old enough to testify, and he testified very bravely. He said, I don't want to be circumcised, and I don't want to live with my dad anymore. So, and the judge said, bang, that's done, no circumcision, and you're living with your mom. So it all worked out for him. All right, here's the circ rates in the US, and we're going to come back to this. This is a fun little map. I love this little map because there's something very interesting about it that's not real obvious. But we're living in one of the lowest circumcision rate states in the country, only 20%. Although what has happened is hospitals have slowed down doing them, and some of the doctors have picked up the slack in their own surgery, which in my article on regulation I mentioned is actually unsafe for the child because he has no period of observation. He's handed back to the parents immediately. They may know nothing about the fact that you can kill a child by only 2 ounces of blood lost. Newborns only have 12 ounces of blood, and they can only lose 20% of it before they'll have a heart attack. So, or hypovolemic shock plus heart attack. So parents don't know that. So the circumcisions that go on in clinics, satellite clinics, are far more dangerous than the hospital sort. Now, here's a bit about medical history, and I love this stuff, and I think you will too. This is great. The demonization of the foreskin is a part of the body, and it's one of the most unusual parts of the body in that it had people that spend so much time hating it. They've really worked at it. It's absolutely amazing. And one of my colleagues, Robert Darby, whom I've never met, but we've corresponded for 15 years now, Robert Darby wrote a book which I really recommend to you called A Surgical Temptation, The Demonization of the Foreskin. He's a very dense writer. He's a very good historian. It's highly footnoted. It's not a fun, easy read, but it's very authoritative, I think would be the best word. And other recommended books for you if you're interested in the topic. This is the old classic by David Gallagher on circumcision, the history of circumcision. And it's a good beginning book. Modern historians have fiddled with it a bit and say he cut a few corners, but it's still a good beginning book. This, Leonard Glick, is a friend of mine. He's a doctor and has a PhD in anthropology. His claim to fame, by the way, is that he did Elvis's induction physical. in 1955. And you can go on the net and see pictures of Landis, so cool, with his stethoscope up on Elvis's chest, and every girl in the country is going, oh God, to be that doctor and be holding a stethoscope. So anyway, and The Sorcerer's Apprentice is a book just out by Rob Darby about the American situation. His other book is about the British situation. And it's $5 on Kindle. It's an easy read. I wrote the back third of it because he appended a long document that Doctors Opposing Circumcision published, and he asked if he could republish it, and we said sure, so it's in there. But anyway, check that out. So now, pre-1870, nobody cared about penises. It wasn't a big issue. I mean, Jews did it, yeah, but they lived in separate communities, and they kind of did their own thing, and no one goofed with them, and it was all sort of unregulated and quiet and so forth. Although an awful lot of anti-Semitism can be traced directly to the circumcision tradition, because there are some aspects of it that Christians found in the Middle Ages rather horrifying, and so they sort of isolated Jews because of that. So Jews have paid a high price for their religious beliefs in that regard. Now, it does seem reasonable that you can not do anything with penises, right? It doesn't make sense that we've all sort of evolved to be self-maintaining. I mean, most of the things about us are self-defending, self-maintaining. We need a little bit of cleaning, but probably less cleaning than we think we do, because those germs on your skin are part of what make you work. They're part of what keep you alive. The balance in your gut of various kinds of bacteria, et cetera, are what keep you alive. So we evolved to be fairly self-maintaining. So before the discovery of germs, though, people wondered what the heck causes disease? Well, there are various theories. One theory is miasma. The Romans, for instance, would never build a city downwind from a big swamp because they felt that swamp gas, what is it, hydrogen sulfide or something like sulfate, caused disease. So people feared smells and things that came through the air and thought that that's what caused disease. Now the other theory is contagion, that when you touch things you could catch disease. Interestingly enough, both these theories are correct. We do know that you can get TB from living in the same house and breathing the same air as somebody who has tuberculosis, correct? And we also know, everybody knows, I think now, that if you touch somebody who's sick or you have an open wound, you touch somebody who's sick, you could probably get that disease as well. Well, the two big adherents are Florence Nightingale, who was a miasma believer. And watch this, I always like this. Quick, do it. See? I don't know very much about PowerPoint, but I do know how to make a little tiny thing. So there's an open window in the back because she was a big believer in fresh air, moving through the house, getting those germs outdoors, constantly bringing the air in. And my wife, the nurse, is very much in the tradition of Florence Nightingale, likes to keep that window open, likes to air out the place. So the other one is a childhood hero of mine, curiously enough, Ignaz Semmelweis, who worked in a German hospital in the 1840s, Austrian hospital in the 1840s, and worked out that the doctors who came up from doing autopsies in the basement and then attended women who were in childbirth had a horrible, horrible mortality rate. Like 50% of the women would die of what was then called puerperal fever, which we would now call Staph aureus probably. And that the midwives who were next door had like a 10% mortality rate, still high, but way different from the doctors. So my mother told me that story when I was like 10 years old, and I've always been impressed with Ignaz Semmelweis's figuring that out and making doctors wash their hands. Now, that's miasma, contagion, and the third one is degeneration. The degenerative theory of the human body suggests that you are a one-use battery, that you're born fully charged, and then throughout your life you slowly dissipate this energy level. And if you think about it intuitively, it's not such a bad idea. I mean, it has a certain cachet, does it not? But if you start applying it, for instance, to sexual things, it gets a bit tricky. I mean, what's too much? You know, have you used up your 1 week supply in 2 days? So anyway, that's an interesting theory. But the next one is my absolute favorite. It's called reflex neurosis. The theory was that if you touched your genitalia, whoops, sorry about that. If you touched your genitalia, a disease would spring up someplace else. Neurosis is the 19th century medical word for nerve overstimulation. It didn't have its Freudian concept at that time. And so you would, if people got, like if you took your child to the doctor in 1870 and he was coughing up blood and stuff, the doctor would say, well, it's pretty obvious he's been touching himself. We've got to do something about this. So that was that theory, and it's an amazing theory. And just for fun, you should rent some night if you're bored, rent Road to Wellville, which is a movie about this era of medical history starring Anthony Hopkins, Matthew Broderick, Bridget Fonda, Dana Carvey. And it wasn't a huge critical success, but it's pretty funny if you know anything about medical history. And my favorite quote, though, is Anthony Hopkins as Dr. Kellogg saying to Matthew Broderick, "An erection, sir, is the flagstaff on your grave." It's one of those great quotes. It's like a Coen Brothers quote, you know. All right, so here's John Harvey Kellogg, MD. He believed that all sex was harmful. He had 40-some foster children, 42 foster children, never had sex with his wife even once. He believed that circumcision should be made painful, that the doctor should make no effort. And remember, circumcisions in this era were not for infants. They didn't know how to do that yet. They were for teenagers whose parents had caught them touching themselves, who had sexually misbehaved, or who were sick. So that's what went on. He and his brother invented cornflakes to control passion. And there's two more characters here. You're getting the hints, aren't you? Is it working out for you? C.W. Post invented Post Toasties and made a fortune. He and Kellogg both lived in Battle Creek, Michigan. And Reverend Sylvester Graham also believed that sex was dangerous. And they all came up with the idea that bland cereals would keep you from being overly stimulated, like eating pickles or eating something exciting would overstimulate you. You'd need to have sex, and of course, that meant horrible things would happen. So, all right, so there's your trivia answer, right? C.W. Post of Post Toasties, Kellogg of Kellogg's Cornflakes, both of Battle Creek, Michigan, and Reverend Sylvester Graham all promoted bland cereals to control sex. I mean, seriously, actual grown-ups believed this stuff in the 1860s and 1870s, but why? Yeah, right. Did you feed them enough cereal? No. All right. So now our map comes back. Look at this. The bullseye is Battle Creek, Michigan. And look at the states that are most highly involved in circumcision in the U.S. by quantity. And I discovered this years ago, kind of accidentally. I thought, Battle Creek, Michigan. And so I sort of drew a line and worked out and I thought to myself, absolutely right. And then it turns out that what Kellogg did is he was rich. So he funded chairs of circumcision. He would go to like the Medical Society of Rockford, Illinois and say, I'll give you $500,000 a year if you promote circumcision heavily. And then he'd go over to Detroit and tell us, and Milwaukee and Madison and Indianapolis or whatever. Wherever he could get a chair funded and get the thing cooked up. And look at the effect he's had. It's now, 40 some years? And it still is working. Now, mind you, there are other reasons. I mean, you could, this is just a correlation type thing, not a causation type thing. You could argue that people in the Midwest are a little bit more conformist and social-minded and do what other people do, and our people on the coasts are a little bit more free thinkers and choose for themselves. You can make up, but it still is interesting. I still find it kind of fascinating. All right, here's another part of it. All these states with the black dots have no medical subsidy for Medicaid. Medicaid doesn't pay for circumcision. You're on your own. It's a cash deal, which we are here in Washington. So that, of course, keeps the rates down somewhat, right? But it also exists because there isn't a compulsion. They feed each other. You don't have the subsidy, therefore people don't do it. Therefore people don't do it. You don't have a subsidy. It all works like that. And if you do the states that are where there is a Medicaid subsidy, look how many of them are in the target area. See what's going on? Another thing you should consider, our children in Washington State are no sicker than the children in Indiana or Illinois or Ohio who have high circumcision rates. So the notion that somehow circumcision is a healthy idea is as bogus as medical ideas come. It's just crap, pure and simple. All right, here's my favorite, and my wife knows where the story's going. Louis A. Sayre was an orthopedic surgeon in New York in the 1870s. And one day on February 9th, 1870, which turns out many years later to be my wedding anniversary, he circumcised a 5-year-old boy. Every year my wife says, are you going to bring up that circumcision thing again on our anniversary? I can't stand it. So he circumcised a boy who probably had polio and then claimed that the boy was cured. And in the old days, before true science, people made outrageous claims for their medical discoveries, usually based on one patient. And often it took this form. They would say, I cured patient A by modality B. And he never came back. And then if you looked at what he did to the patient, it was so painful. Why would he come back? So they had all these marvelous miracle cures are based on like a one patient, what do we call now? A data point of one. So anyway, he because of the cure of this boy, he gave a speech called Partial Paralysis from Reflex Irritation Caused by Congenital Commotion and Adherent Prepuce. I'll translate that for you. Partial polio from touching himself, got that? And caused by a foreskin that can't be retracted, and it's also sticky and it's stuck there. That's what it all means. Unfortunately, congenital phimosis and adherent prepuce are normal until you're about 10 years old, and even normal at 15 years old for boys. But anyway, he and his colleagues managed together to fuel a 100-year anti-autoerotic erotic hysteria. And I have to tell you, this is another one of those fascinating little connections. We still have in the billing book for medical procedures, in the ICD it's called, a code called 605, redundant prepuce and phimosis, adherent prepuce, phimosis congenital. Does that sound familiar? That's his speech from 1870 that is still in medicine today. So what happens in lots and lots of states in the US is that the child is diagnosed entirely fraudulently as having a tight foreskin. All children have tight foreskins when they're born. And he's given surgery because the doctor says, well, it's a problem. See, it's right in our billing book here for procedures we can do for conditions that exist. And I've seen tons and tons of medical records in the 15 years or so I've been doing this work, in which you can just see the billing 605 right at the bottom. Circumcision 605. So, thus began a 100-year era of masturbatory hysteria, which still lingers, if only in locker room jokes. Some of you probably know that locker room joke about, can I do it till I need glasses? Based on the old, you will go blind. Because the notion that you'll go blind or go bald or grow hair on your hands, etc., or get sick or be weak or couldn't win the big game are all 19th century medical ideas that are kind of embedded in our culture. And these are some of the memes that have been created as a result of that era. Sexual behavior drains your life force. Erogenous irritation causes disease. Amputations would cure that behavior and protect your health. And any pain from the procedure would provide a moral lesson about not misusing your body. So, this is fun stuff. Julian, do you remember this from years ago? I gave a lecture years ago at my daughter's college. I'm sorry, it's my daughter Julian, on the fun parts of medical history, which is entirely, you could do a lot on this, but we're just going to do a couple minutes worth. But here, you could buy these for your children, saddle quality leather with locks on the back so that they couldn't touch themselves at night. I don't know what, if the child needed to pee at 2 a.m., I don't know what went on, but you have to wonder. Here's one of my personal favorites, the battery-powered fan, which looks to be prepared for things that stand up occasionally. And if you wanted to pay extra, you could get the water-cooled version. This was a particularly nifty one. You wore this device that alerted, you accidentally had an erection in the middle of the night, all of a sudden the phonograph would go off. So, you gotta love that stuff. It gets a little more brutal, like parents would put this on. Now, here's the thing all of you may not know. Some of you do, of course, know this. Certainly men know this. Men have 3 or 4 erections during every night's sleep. They occur during your rapid eye movement sleep. Nobody knows why. Nobody's done a lot of research on it. I guess you can't get a PhD in medicine on that particular topic. But it's completely normal. As a matter of fact, if you don't have those, you have a problem you need attending to. And anybody who wore this wouldn't get a minute's sleep. A minute's decent sleep anyway. This is ridiculous. So anyway, the next one, however, is a little bit more humane. The spikes don't come on till a little later, and they're shorter. So, I suppose you could call that an improvement. That's definitely V2. Now, notice that it says prevents night emissions by arousing the wearer. They were terrified of nocturnal emissions, these guys, just terrified, because you were letting your life force go away. I saw a stat one time when I was reading some medical books on this that said that an ounce of seminal fluid was a loss of a quart of blood. That was the equivalence. That was a standard rule, by the way. So anyway, and just for a little bit of social history, when President Garfield was assassinated in 1881, he was done by a guy named Charles Guiteau, who was a completely insane lawyer who didn't get a government job and was angry about it, so he shot Garfield. And when they did, they hung him about a week later. This is long before many appeals, right? They hung him about a week later, did an autopsy, and guess what? He had a tight foreskin. So they said, well, there you go. I mean, that accounts for his insanity. If only his mother had attended to him earlier. So here's some basic anatomy for you. This little sort of pointy end here on this bronze statue, and I forget where I got this, but it's been years and years ago, is called an acropostion. It's the little pointy part where the foreskin comes together and creates a little sort of orifice. There's muscles in there, very much like the other sphincter type muscles you have in your body to keep out pathogens. Makes sense. Well, the Romans and Greeks prized this. If you had one of these as a man, you'd strut around with your acropostion waving in the breeze, and everybody thought you'd be really cool. This is the part of the body that the Jews cut off in the old days. They did no more than that. The original circumcision, the biblical type circumcision, was just removing the acropostion. The more brutal Jewish circumcision came to be in the Hellenic period, which is about 200 BCE, before the Common Era. And when the rabbis found out that a lot of Jews who wanted to compete in the Olympic Games were stretching what little foreskin they had to make it longer, because in Greek and Roman culture, if you showed your glands, that was extremely obscene because it's sexually provocative. Whereas if you didn't, if your glands was covered, you could be in public with no clothes on. That was considered perfectly fine. So the acropostion was the thing that everyone was after. Now then, so male anatomy 101, and by the way, medical training has really lost track of what happened with male genitalia. And it seems crazy to me. I've been doing this for so long, I keep thinking, why would male doctors attack the very part of the body they happen to have? I can see them attacking women. I mean, and there's a whole history of that we don't have time to go into. But attacking themselves, their own sex, I don't get that. But I'll tell you that 67% of US medical books do not even depict a male, a natural male of the kind a European would recognize, which strikes me as very odd. So Avery's Neonatology, which is a book on newborns, in 205 suggests an excuse for our modern ignorance of male genitalia, and that is, because circumcision is so common in the United States, the natural history of the preputial development has been lost, and one must depend on observations made in countries in which circumcision is usually not practiced. And they're quite right, except would that we paid attention to it. There's an awful lot of stuff that goes on right now in which no attention is paid whatsoever. Now, I attend 3 cases a week. In fact, I have an absolute brutal one that I got last night. You remember me horrified, sitting at the table almost in tears. A horrifying case of a woman whose boy was forcibly retracted by a doctor and had all kinds of problems. And in 1981, the American Academy of Pediatrics took a survey themselves and found out that 78% of pediatricians, these are physicians, you understand, did not understand infant hygiene. They gave obsolete or dangerous advice, and they were willing to admit that in 1981. In 2006, I did a survey in St. Louis at the annual American Academy of Family Practice Doctors, and out of 113 that our team surveyed, three understood how to care for an intact boy, which is, I think, just shocking. And now, it gets worse. In 2012, in September 2012, the American Academy of Pediatrics, and I quote them here, the non-circumcised penis should be washed with soap and water. Bzzzt. No. Most adhesions present at birth resolve by age 2 to 4 months. Bzzzt. They resolve when they resolve, which can be age 10 on average, but it could be age 18. So here's these guys. This is our major pediatric organization, which doesn't get fundamental anatomy at the gross level, and yet they're doing other sophisticated things, which I highly approve of course. But I mean, I just find this astonishing. Oh, sure. I mean, I bet there's people in this room who've been forcibly retracted. I have no doubt of it. Absolutely no doubt of it. Now then, let's just do some quick anatomy. When a child is born, his foreskin is fused to his glands by a protective membrane, which serves very much the same purpose as the female hymen. It's protective in youth when you're not sexually active, keeps out bacteria, fecal material, irritation from ammonia, etc. It's actually an ingenious design. And you can imagine that there were hominoids 100,000 years ago who didn't have this feature and who slowly faded away because they had infections, didn't wish to have sex, gave each other infections, and their group dwindled. We are essentially survivors, are we not? We have survived a long process of nature tampering with, changing, mutating, wiggling stuff around, doing fixes, and we're here today because of these sorts of things. So that's a natural feature. I think it deserves respect simply because it's there. If you have to make a medical argument against it before you can start ripping it apart and saying it shouldn't be there. And I handle, as I say, 100 cases of that each year. Here's a little boy. Notice acroplastion. Kind of cute, huh? And here he is being gently retracted, and you can see how tightly bound that is. That's because it's tightly bound and will remain tightly bound for a very, very long time. By the way, I would never allow a doctor to do this if I had an infant son now, because there is hardly one around. I mean, I know the ones I trust. It's a handful. I would hardly allow anyone, even a medical professor, to do this because they would do it too brutally. Here's what's really going on. Inside the boy's penis is a series of ridges, they're called, R-E-T-E, ridges. And on the top of those ridges are extremely sensitive Meissner's corpuscles, they're called. And you have them on your hands right now. If you rub your fingernails across the back of your hand, you'll discover that you can feel that, but not at a high degree of accuracy. You couldn't sort coins looking for the milled edge by touching them to the back of your hand. But turn around and you can easily sort coins with the milled edge on your palm, because you have a very dense collection of these things. On a male penis, it's 3 times more sensitive than your fingers in the sheer density of Meissner's corpuscles. Now the glans, curiously enough, has very little sensation. It has about the same sensation. Women, you might be interested in trying this. If you want to know how sensitive a man's the male glans is, it's about as sensitive as your earlobe, which is, sort of sensitive, but not super sensitive. I mean, you can't do any coin sorting with it, that's for sure. Now, it acts, of course, as a storage device. It maintains a certain level of moisture, which you need, and it acts as a shaping device. It makes perfect sense. It is very poorly innervated. It is not part of the equipment of a male for the erogenous equipment of the male. I'll give you $50. This is an offer right now. This is out of my account, Michelle. I'll give you $50 if you can find a medical book in the University of Washington Medical Library that correctly identifies the erogenous tissue on the human male. $50. They all talk about how the glans is the seat of male sexual sensation. Most 12-year-old boys know better than that. It's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. Here's the precise target of the 19th century circumciser, who, by the way, was intact. Because, of course, they invented it, but they weren't circumcised. Make sense? So they were looking after these ridges, here they are right here, which are very, very highly innervated. There's a test, a neurological testing device you can use that has ever-decreasing diameter of monofilament. It has a certain handle on it and has this monofilaments, and you have to deflect them to a certain degree. And you can tell whether skin is sensitive or not, and it's used especially for burn victims and people who have peripheral neuropathy and other kinds of things where you need to get an objective measure of sensitivity, sexual or otherwise. And it's off scale. That tissue is so sensitive, it's off scale on Semmes-Weinstein. Now then, here's how it works, and it seems ingenious. If you were sitting around designing a human penis, this is how you would design it, right? The erogenous tissue is stored moist face down on the glans, which is a storage device and provides heat and comfort for it in a sense. And then, when it's needed, it everts, and there it is, ready to work. And if you think about it, and as long as we're all grown-ups here, I can tell you that it makes sense to have a sort of deeper penetration for reproductive purposes. If the glands were too sensitive, you might never get the kind of penetration you need for fertility. Do you see? So it makes sense that the erogenous tissue of the male is farther back than you'd think, closer to the body than you think. Makes perfect sense to me. It apparently doesn't make sense to your average urologist. All right, so here's the results of circumcision, which is a bit brutal. There's a typical male, right? He's got sensitivity on both the bottom, and this is the bottom side. This is the dorsal side, or ventral side, rather. And he's got sensation all the way around. This is the circumcised man. That's all that's left. A truncated frenulum, that's this little tether right here, is truncated, and that's easily the most sensitive part of any male. And he's got nothing left of the ridge bands, and no particular sexual sensation on the top side. That's just the way it is. So I'm asking you a quick ethical question. And we're not going to try and answer it, but let's think about it. Are you entitled to what you were born with? And even though you can function without all that stuff, what about when you're 60 and 70 and 80 and 90? Of course, One argument might be, well, you're not entitled to enjoy your body when you can't reproduce anymore or when you oughtn't to be reproducing anymore. That's one ethical argument. But I think that we still have to confront the notion of what are people entitled to. So, unfortunately, the circumcised man has minimal erogenous tissue, truncated frenulum, no ridge band, and proximal tissue displaced distally. The tissue, and I want to put too fine a point on it, but this tissue would normally not contact the partner. Couldn't. It's tucked back. It's toward the body. It's only been drawn forward by the circumcision. So here's the actual loss. If you draw, and John Erickson, the late John Erickson, did this series of drawings on this. If you draw with a pen at the outer edge of an intact male and stretch it back, the line will end up here. By the way, this line that's right here is buried in his pubic hair. That's 3 inches long of tissue and 5 inches in circumference, which equals 15 square inches or 90 square centimeters if you can think in square centimeters. So lost is everything that's in there. And notice this. Notice the vascularization right here, right? This complex web of vascularization doesn't occur on circumcised men. It simply doesn't exist. And yet it feeds in a high-speed amount of blood to make sexual nerves function. All right, here's what made circumcision really take off during the 30s and after World War II. It's this device here, the Gomco clamp, which meant that you didn't have to do microsurgery anymore. You just install the clamp, slowly turn the nut down, because you're not cutting the tissue, you're just crushing it into goo, basically. And then after it sits there for a while and the clamp's undone, the child won't bleed. So that meant that any idiot medical student could do circumcisions. You didn't need a trained surgeon or a trained microsurgeon. And remember, you're working on a structure not much bigger than 3/4 of my smallest finger, something about 1.5 inches long. So this was really the Gatling gun of circumcision. It's really caused its huge run-up. It's uniquely painful. Anybody can do it. It does control bleeding, to be fair. But the great sadness is that because this bell is really shallow, all of that ridge band gets cut off. Now, the Japanese have a clamp that circumcises a male but protects his erogenous tissue. It takes the tissue off near the body. It takes the same amount of tissue off proximally, so that when the tissue is pulled, the remaining tissue is pulled into place, all the erogenous tissue is permanently exposed, which, I don't know, sounds like it'd be awful, frankly. But that's how they get the look of a circumcision without the damage from it. Now, here's a graphic demonstration of how it works. If you put the bell over here and cut here, you're taking off twice as much tissue as you think you are, because it's a double-folded tissue. Do you see that? Here's the cut lines right here. That's why this is so brutal. And unfortunately, Jewish circumcisions are using these modern medical tools, which were, frankly, intended to mute the male. They were intended. They were not designed whimsically or casually or accidentally. They were intended to do precisely what they're doing here. All right, here's the Plaster bell, which is an innocuous-looking version of it and is commonly used. This one strangles. Instead of crushing over the course of 10 minutes, it strangles for a week or so, and then the tissue falls off because it's yes, it does interfere with breastfeeding. There's no doubt about it. Yeah, and that would be a common story, I'm sorry to say. All right, so here are the lingering myths. Foreskin is a vestigial insensate cover, when in fact it is, by my friend Hugh Young says, it's not the candy, it's not the wrapper, it is the candy. That's his. Sexual function unchanged. It is simply stunningly dishonest to make that claim. I don't care who you are, how smart you are. You make that claim about circumcision, you're being just unbelievably dishonest about how neurology works. It is definitely painful, and yet most kids don't get any pain control whatsoever. Of course children can't describe the trauma they've gone under, but we now know from animal studies and from studies of preemies who get healed sticks and scalp IVs and all sorts of other things in the neonatal intensive ward, they actually have brain changes. They actually will become more sensitive to pain as adults because of all the painful procedures they've had as a child, which suggests that pain in infancy has a long-term anatomical neurological effect that we don't even quite understand yet. Oops, let me bump back for a second. It's worth mentioning. There's, of course, the meme that circumcision prevents STDs, and we can do a whole presentation on that, and I won't. I did that at University of Nevada a few years ago. You'll just need it later anyway, is the notion that if we goof with your son's penis enough and pull back and destroy that membrane, he'll probably will need a circumcision. He'll get infected, he'll have scar tissue, there'll be all kinds of reasons why you could give. So in a way, they fed each other. The ignorance of how the anatomy works, the brutal forced retractions fed circumcision. I call it, in my writings, a gateway drug. Forced retraction is a gateway drug for circumcision. So, and intact boys require demanding hygiene. Makes no sense. Our primate ancestors were looking for food and trying to survive. They were not scrubbing their children's genitalia every other day. It wasn't happening. I live in a marina. One of the women is an executive at the zoo. I had her check with her primatologist whether that behavior is ever seen in primates. She said, absolutely not. Doesn't happen. All right, so here's bioethics. I promised you that I'd make you a bioethicist in 10 minutes. I swear I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. The 5 concepts in bioethics that you should memorize if you want to be a real good bioethicist are these: beneficence, non-maleficence, which is not a common word, but it just means don't do badness. I think it would be the best thing to describe it. Justice, autonomy, and proportionality. And in bioethics, you always view everything from the patient's perspective. You do not inquire about what outsiders want, what proxy people signing a consent form want, what the family wants, what distant relatives want, what the adoptive parents want, what the foster parents want. It's irrelevant. The focus is on the patient's immediate needs and maybe some long-term concerns, but mostly the immediate needs. And here's how it works. You ask yourself, this is a series of questions, this flowchart, if you will. Beneficence, is the procedure necessary or beneficial? And is that proportional? Non-maleficence, does it avoid harm or suffering? Well, if it's an unnecessary procedure, even a little bit of harm is a lot of harm. Justice, would we choose this procedure for ourselves were we in a similar circumstance? Make sense? And autonomy, is the person being treated as a separate person or a member of a community that must be like that community, which gets real tricky. Could it wait for patient assent? And proportionality, is the risk and pain worth the gain? Is there an alternative? Now, I submit to you, if you apply those to infant circumcision, which is non-therapeutic, which is based on custom and appearance and social norms that are imposed, it fails. And you have to, in this scheme, meet every requirement. It's not that you can fail 4 and get 1, or even get 3 and fail 2 and you still get 60%. It doesn't work like that. You have to, every question has to be answered perfectly in order for the procedure to be considered ethical and appropriate. See how easy? You know, this is an entire semester of bioethics in actually 2 slides. It's amazing, but you have to remember. Let's see, I need to know, don't I? Beneficence, non-maleficence, justice, proportionality, and what am I missing? Autonomy, exactly, the tricky one. So, all right, here's an article I wrote called The Completely Unregulated Practice of Male Circumcision. If you're interested in it, it's just, you know, I was going to bring copies today, and I thought, why bother? And so if you want to read it, it's on New Male Studies. All you do is just put New Male Studies in my surname, or just put New Male Studies, you'll see my surname in the latest issue. And it's, I think, worth reading. You'll be astonished. You'll be astonished at the lack of regulation in this entire practice. I mean, you can, honest to God, do a circumcision this afternoon. I've got some tools I could loan you if you want. All right, I think we're drawing to a close. But I have a proverb for you, which I've used in other lectures in other countries. That country is good where old people plant trees, whose shade they will never enjoy. Thanks. So, sorry, I lost it there for a second. Questions? Sure.
Just two real quick. You said the retractable thing is the gateway to...
That forcibly retracting the child as a billable procedure, that's what this is all about, is a gateway drug to circumcision. In a sense, if you injure the kid, and you get scarring and has problems, you can justify the circumcision. So it's a way to get at it. I mean, I'm a lawyer by training, so I have a little cynical side, which you acquire in law school. But the fact of the matter is that, don't you think it's horrible that a doctor can injure a child's natural body, which needs no intervention whatsoever, and then get the benefit of a secondary procedure to either help him or even a tertiary procedure to do a circumcision merely because you injured him in the first instance. I mean, that's the horror of it.
And then the glands or the skin that is there before it's circumcised, you said is like the most sensitive
Yes.
in the human body.
Am I hearing the questions? I think I was asked to say them again, and I've forgotten. Need to hear it? Yeah, you're asking about the, you can say it real loud if you want to.
Glands or the pre-circumcised skin is the most sensitive in the male human body.
Yeah.
So that
Like your lips, like you're more sensitive than your lips, more sensitive than your fingertips.
that would mean that it was the most painful
Yeah.
sensitivity when it's removed.
Yeah, exactly. Now, I'm not a neurologist or a neuroscientist, but I can tell you that sometimes it's the case that tissue is erogenous only after a certain level of stimulation. Prior to that, all it feels is contact and warmth and movement and so forth. Meissner's corpuscles, though, are incredibly sensitive. I mean,
So
you can reach in your pocket and tell a penny from a nickel
Nerve endings.
or a dime from a penny, yeah, because of the accuracy of these things. And the intact penis is that much more accurate. Yeah.
Are legal steps being taken to bring in legislation to ban the practice?
Well, yeah, I was part of the team in San Francisco that tried to support a citizens initiative and a coalition of religious groups, Jews, Muslims, and fundamentalist Christians, and the latter group surprised the heck out of me, but that's got thinking about that, put together a challenge to the law. And unfortunately, they won on an interesting technicality, and that was in California, only the state may regulate medicine. So the judge said, well, San Francisco, you can't be regulating medicine. But in that very article I showed you earlier, I asked the question, well, is this really medicine? I mean, if it's non-therapeutic surgery that the patient doesn't need, that can be done by anyone with devices you can buy on eBay, is it really medical? And so I mean that's the analysis I used as a lawyer.
It's plastic surgery.
It is plastic surgery, yeah. But elective plastic surgery is a Latin expression that means adult.
Yeah, elective means I want it done to me.
Right, and you have power to elect it.
Yeah.
There actually is plastic surgery going on to teenagers these days. Breast augmentation, vaginal stuff. In cultures in which they do that. It's rather appalling. I mean, I don't know why plastic surgeons do that, because technically, if a 14-year-old girl gets plastic surgery, she can sue when she's 19 for being allowed to have it done, even if she asks for it. Question, Erica. Oh, I'm sorry. You're being saluted there.
You mentioned forcible retraction. Is that something that you have to watch out for?
Yeah.
Why would a doctor perform that?
Because they're stupid. Did I make that clear enough? It's amazing to me. Can we take a minute to read this? Are we ahead of time? How are we doing on time? Are we? I got this letter last night. It almost brought me to tears. Dear Mr. John V. Geisheker, I am the young mom of 2 boys. We chose not to circumcise our boys due to multiple reasons, ranging from their father being born overseas, which is always very helpful, to understanding birth and entrance into a new and unfamiliar world to be a traumatic enough experience. Why put them through more? At my son's 2nd-year-old well baby checkup, this is always how they begin. At the pediatrician's office, I asked about the little white bumps that were all along my son's penis, concerned there was something wrong with him. He informed me that it was called smegma, which was similar to toe jam and had gotten caught between the foreskin and the penis. He also proceeded to inform me that the penis did not look like it should, because the complete bulb of the penis should be able to be visible when you pull on the foreskin. He then began to forcibly push on my sweet boy's foreskin until his penis turned purple, as my 2-year-old was screaming and using all of his effort to get off the table. I was asked to hold his legs down. At this point, I'm crying along with Caleb, my now 2-year-old. And finally, the foreskin releases and I see blood all around. The doctor then took a dry Q-tip looking object and dug around that area that was bloody to remove all of the smegma. When he had finally finished and I was able to take Caleb into my arms, he couldn't even be held like a normal, because even the slightest amount of pressure on his penis was extremely painful. The doctor looked at both of us, who were both crying, and said he's better now than he was when he came in. His penis looks like it's supposed to. Now be sure and put him in a warm bath and pull the foreskin back during bath and at each diaper change. I felt as though my son had been violated, but I also thought, what do I do now? I didn't go to medical school. He's the one who was the doctor. My son calmed down by the time we got to the car, but upon arriving home, he had begun uncontrollable screaming and pulling on his diaper. I found that he had urinated when I removed it, and it stung so bad it had put him in hysterics again. More tears occurred in the bathtub as I attempted to clean the site of the wound following the doctor's orders and doing what I thought was best for him. I apologized the entire time and telling him that Mommy was only doing this because the doctor said it was going to make his boo-boo better. His penis was extremely swollen. He woke up in the night several times screaming for about 5 days. Since the forced retraction occurred on a Friday, I didn't call the doctor's office until Monday. As soon as the office opened on Monday morning, I explained how much the pain he was in and was told the only thing I could do was Neosporin and give him a painkiller. I then got a bill in the mail for $100 worth of charges for penile surgery. I was never asked if I wanted this procedure to take place. The doctor just did it. Can a child really go through a surgery without a parent's permission? Seriously, they want me to pay for this? As a parent, I figured nothing I had to say was going to matter, since it was my word against the medical professionals, so I bit my tongue and paid the bill. But the rest of it, which I'm not going to read, is about her second son, who she forcibly retracted on her own and now suddenly discovered that you're not supposed to do that, and she's feeling horribly, horribly guilty about both her kids. Great sadness, and I handle 3 of those cases a week. That was last night's.
This is the responsibility of the child educator.
The whole chain of command, frankly.
Well, when I taught childbirth and parents opted not to have circumcision, I explained to them, do not make an effort to retract, that it will occur between 2 and 12,
Right.
usually.
And you know, this all comes from the 1860s, 1870s. There was this theory that your child there would be a buildup of stuff in there, scary stuff. And he would get itchy, and then he would touch himself, and then he'd get tuberculosis. It was this sort of chain of bad things.
They're supposed to touch themselves because
Yeah, it helps
part of the loosening of it is
Right. Plus, primates practice their sexual behavior before they're sexually active.
And
We know this.
that actually helps to retract it painlessly.
Yeah, you're quite right. There's a question in the back, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I advise a lot of guys on that. No, but what you're doing is protecting what you have left and re-moistening it. Your outer skin is keratinized. It's like the keratin in your fingernails. It's become dry and it's less sensitive as a result. Well, the genitalia and the mouth and the nose, et cetera, are mucosal tissue. And they'll revert, even if you dry them out, they'll revert to mucosal tissue. So men who are restored cover their glands up, which in a matter of a few weeks will be moist again as it was when they were not circumcised. And that tissue, because it's moist, its nerve endings are closer to the surface. And so they're much more sensitive. So you do regain some sensitivity, but you can't get back the ridge band or the frenulum or any of that, or any of the important stuff. Just it can't be regained. So, how does the restoration work? There are a whole bunch of methods. If you're interested, email me. I've got cards up here. Anybody's interested in restoration, it's intriguing. Or you can just go to Google and put in foreskin restoration. Buzzing. There's 100 websites. It's very much. Excuse me.
I have one of the books with
Oh, good. Yeah, we'll show that around in a little bit. Yeah, it'd be good. There are lots of techniques. There are mechanical devices you can buy. Some are good. Some are kind of hokey. It's very much a bottom-up thing. Men discovered it in California in like the 60s, and it's sort of swept. There's about 50,000 guys in the U.S. restoring right now, and I've tried it. It works. Yeah.
So I think even to this day, I see occasional papers looking at an association between penile cancer and the lack of circumcision.
Right.
Do you know what the state of the art of that data is?
Oh, I know the data. here's the oncology nurse.
I'm an oncology nurse for 30 years, and that's absolutely not true.
The rate is 1 in 100,000 men get penile cancer.
So minimal, and
Yeah.
it would just be as if you just took a random sample of people. So there's no association with not being circumcised with penile.
Well, I just see it published. by
Yeah, well, it's a meme.
I don't look it up because it's not my
It's a meme.
but I see it all.
If you're a meme, if you're a lazy journalist and your editor says to do a thing on circumcision, you can find anything you want because there's enough people out there pushing it, and they've published.
Rewarding.
Yeah.
The community that's making the profit on this procedure is promoting this kind of pseudoscience.
Right.
I had a conversation with a female urologist, and I asked her how did she stand on male circumcision? And she says, well, you know, it prevents penile cancer. And I said, well, then why don't we remove female breast buds, because the cancer rate is much higher.
Significantly higher.
Like 2 out of 5 women will get breast cancer. And she goes, yeah, you're right, we shouldn't do it.
Yeah.
She clicked that click.
So it might be there's more penile cancer just because there's more tissue there.
Yeah.
No, it's very
I don't know.
insignificant.
It is?
The number of cases are
It's
so
so rare
insignificant compared to breast
It's-
cancer.
it's a cancer
but
of-
we wouldn't
yeah.
think of removing female breast buds. It wouldn't enter our mind for
Yeah.
1 second to prevent cancer, something that's going to happen decades later.
We say, my physician's group says, you're more likely to die of circumcision than you are to die of penile cancer.
Oh, how true.
Probably
Yeah.
the infection.
Yeah.
It would be.
Absolutely. Yeah, Erica. Oh, yep, sorry. Have I not been scanning enough?
One thing was that I saw a thing recently that was published in Bio about the STD risk.
Right.
Is that one of the
Well, I mean, I've got tons of stuff. I've got folders called My Stuff and Their Stuff. That's literally what they're called. And you can find studies that say all kinds of things about STDs. The latest one is HIV, of course, in Africa. I mean, we'd have a whole session on that, and I already did that once before.
I had a thing. Is all of the most recent research like just completely flawed?
Well,
that shows that it's beneficial.
Well, let me answer her question first because it's preliminary to it. There are studies that show slight increases in some STDs for intact men, non-circumcised men. But it also shows slight decreases in other STDs. It's kind of based on the STD. But the rates are so small, the percentages are so teeny as to be largely insignificant. I mean, I'm from New Zealand. It has actually lower STD rates than the US, and nobody's circumcised. So it's just, sorry about that. It's just, well, yeah, and there are a lot.
I don't know.
Yeah, no, there are ways to prevent STDs. There's just no question about it. But to answer your question about HIV, which I do know a fair amount about, the problem with the African studies is it showed a tiny little increase in uptake of HIV among men who were not circumcised. It showed a slightly less rate for men who were circumcised. And they compared these two tiny numbers and said, well, one of them, it's like comparing 1% with 1.5%. And you say, wow, that's 50% more because it's 5%. You see, it's a trick of statistics to say that. So the reason you see that 60% figure all the time in a newspaper is they're not telling you what the absolute rate is. They're telling you what the relative rate was between lines. And here's the other things they didn't tell you. Circumcision in Africa only protects the male from getting infected by HIV from an infected female. It does nothing for her. She will get HIV at exactly the same rate, even higher, because he may argue, I don't need a condom, I'm circumcised. And we see that happening all over Africa. And I'm telling you, the Gates Foundation is funding all this crap. And I have to drive past them every day, and I'm thinking, what's going on up there? It's amazing. Yeah, it's bad stuff. The other, it really is risking the health and welfare of millions of African women who will, in those cultures, not have the social power to resist the onslaught of men who claim to be immune to HIV. It's terrible. It's a disaster in the making. Of course. And the other thing, these studies didn't account for non-sexual transmission and male to male. Yeah, exactly. And bathing and a lot of other stuff they didn't control for. Yeah. Yeah. And exactly. And that point has been made actually in print. Yeah. Question again.
Well, since you're saying that component is the most sensitive part, I was wondering if there's like a correlation between circumcision and like ED later in life.
Erectile dysfunction.
If there's less sensitivity.
Boy, no one wants to go there, but I will tell you anecdotally, I happen to know, that I think that American men probably use more Viagra and other drugs than other cultures do. The problem is you can't tease out the fact that it's partly a therapeutic drug and partly a recreational drug. How do you distinguish between those people who are using it for jollies and those people who are using it because they're absolutely tied to it? So people don't know the answer. That's a very good study to do. People don't know the answer to that question yet. And I guarantee you the American medical establishment probably doesn't want to know the answer to that question. Okay. Question, yeah?
Yeah, so I don't know
Vicky.
statistics on this, but anecdotally I know at least my encounters with the more fundamentalist
Well, it shouldn't, of course.
I'm wondering, how much of a role that could have played in the fact that we don't have female general circumcision here. Because I know Kellogg did do that.
Oh, yeah.
Where girls were caught masturbating.
Yeah. No. We didn't have time to do that. You appreciate that I had to cull what could have been a 12-hour lecture down to an hour and a half. And we have a long history of female genital mutilation in this country, lasting into the 1970s. This is within the lifetime of everybody in this room. And it used to be paid for by Medicare, or Medicaid, I guess it would be. And it was a routine procedure. If the woman was neurotic and unhappy and, et cetera, you took her clitoris because it was causing her certain kinds of concern. I know circumcised women. I've met circumcised women from Middle Eastern cultures. I know them from American culture. Dr. Kellogg used to use pure phenol. Phenol is carbolic acid. Its major feature is that when you touch it to skin, it instantly collapses all the cells and dries them out into like leather. And so he used that pure full strength on girls to stop them from touching themselves, which would have made them completely sexual dysfunctional, aside from the horror of the event itself on that most sensitive tissue. And they used to take out sections of the male's nerve, because there are nerves that run along just down inside the penis. There are nerves that run along that feed back. And they used to take a section out, maybe take a 1-inch or 2-inch section out so that the nerves could never rejoin. And then the boy would have a penis that was completely dead tissue. It would be like, what happens when you sleep on your arm or something? It'd be like that. It would be fairly useless. They did that routinely. Mostly on kids in like orphanages and stuff where they had control of the boys. And the boys didn't have good advocates for something else. Yeah, the horror, we could have a whole section on the horrors of 19th century medicine, male and female. Females got a bad deal too. It faded away eventually because in a crazy way culturally, people didn't think in that area that women did or should have sexual needs of their own. And so the notion that it was a problem you needed to address was one that was so easily addressed by just a bit of shame that why would you bother with all the surgery? Does that make sense? Question. Have we had somebody who hasn't asked one? Right. Sorry. Sorry.
Just a quick comment. There
Yeah.
is an approach now available to try to reduce the risk of penile cancer, and that's HPV vaccination.
Oh, yeah. Good point. Good point. Yeah. Although, yeah, I'm more impressed by the HPV vaccine for protecting women, because I don't know if you want to give it routinely to boys to protect them from a 1 in 100,000 risk of getting cancer when they're 80. Which strikes me is that at that point it's NNT. It's number needed to treat.
It's herd immunity for oral, cervical, and penile cancer.
Yeah, I'm not. It's not 100% effective. The efficacy is like in the 60s, I think. So it's not what you'd call perfect, but I'm not opposed to it. I'm not one of those people who's opposed to immunizations.
Saying there is approach.
Yeah, no, I agree. Question.
So I grew up in Michigan.
Oops. Anywhere near Battle Creek? You have all your parts?
In an evangelical Christian home.
Oh, wow.
And it didn't even occur to me that circumcision was a bad thing until I moved out here, got involved in the atheist community, and heard people talking about it. I'm like, well, what's the big deal?
That's because you're a fish that lived in Michigan water.
So how do you start to combat that idea? Because it's so ingrained in my Michigan culture that I just assumed everybody's circumcised, because of course they are.
Well, some of us have been, I'm a newbie to this issue in relative terms, because there are people out there who have been working on it for 30 or more years. And it's slowly dropping down. The rate is slowly damping down. And West Coast is a classic example. We reached a tipping point, because if you circumcise your child in a Washington State hospital today, you're definitely in the minority. And you've doomed your child to being in a minority too, because 80% of his friends are going to be intact. So the argument that doctors used to use, that he needs to look like his father and he needs to look like his friends, is basically gone in this state, in Oregon and California. So, yeah. Question, yeah.
Do you know of any cases of men who have sued their parents?
Yes, I know the very big case. What's his name again? Guy in Virginia? William Stowell.
What was the question?
He asked whether anybody has sued over being circumcised. He sued the doctor. Yeah. And won 50
I
grand.
was going to say one or the other, but if it's the parents who made the decision.
Well, the problem is that if you,
Doctor gives them informed consent.
yeah,
Recommends
Exactly, that's the problem. I mean, the doctor is going to say, well, the parents asked me to, and I'm obliged to do stuff like that when the parents ask. And of course, the parents are going to say, but he told us it was helpful and that our son would like it and it was necessary. And then there's the problem of the statutes of limitation, which run out before the child is of majority. And we're in a state that won't allow you, like if you're a child and your parents are negligent and something happened to you, like it turns out you got something inside your abdomen that was left there from a childhood surgery. You used to be able to sue at age 18 in your own name, and the medical society made sure that went bye-bye. And that's true in Oregon and also true in California. So in none of those states can you sue at age 18 for something that happened to you as a child. They all have what are called statutes of repose. A statute of repose is kind of an ultimate statute of limitation that says we don't care how much evidence you have, how fraudulent it was, how misled you were, you're out. And that's really what's the dampener on those lawsuits.
I think that the people we see who harbor that anger that they were circumcised, we encourage them to use that anger to help educate people not to do it for their children, or just to use that as a catharsis to get through that anger.
Plus, I encourage them to restore.
Yeah. And but it's really hard because if a boy goes to the parents, they probably were told it was an okay thing to do. And now they're feeling the terrible guilt of, well, I was doing what I thought was the best thing for you at the time. So it's really hard. I mean, that you lose a lot of contact with your, with the parents who probably were told of it.
And some of us parents were not given the option as to whether or not we wanted our child.
No, that's a common story. All of Michelle's brothers are circumcised, and her late father said they never asked us. It was Indiana, it was the 1970s, 1950s, and they just did whatever they wanted to do. It was a, tell me? Yeah.
My uncle was an aircraft mechanic in the Navy for years and years up at Oak Harbor. They needed him to go on the aircraft carrier to do some work, and he was 45 years old, and he couldn't go on the ship unless he was circumcised.
What? Seriously?
For a Navy regulation for cleanliness.
I have heard that. I just find it hard to believe.
Yeah, and so he was.
Yeah.
He said he wished he wasn't.
Well, let me give you a story to add to your collection. Does everyone know who Erwin Rommel was? Yeah. The Desert Fox, North Africa, World War II. So anyway, Erwin Rommel was the Desert Fox. He was a Panzer tank commander in World War II. He was a genius, yeah, and he was hung. Hitler hung him for disloyalty, but his son is still living. And there's what's called the sand myth, that people were circumcised because they had to fight in Africa because they get sand under their foreskin. So one of my colleagues wrote to Erwin Rommel, speaks fluent German, wrote to him and asked him whether there were any circumcisions of Germans who were all intact. Because first of all, Germany was very anti-Semitic, and you wouldn't want to look like a Jew, let alone go through the procedure. So he said, no, it never happened. Never happened. There were no circumcisions of Germans because they were hanging around sand. Question?
So you mentioned that it's legal for anybody to do this.
Yeah, well, I mean, here's the thing. Your local district, if you do it badly, your local district attorney will, and you have to call 911, and your child almost bleeds out and goes over to Harborview and gets 3 quarts of blood and stuff. They'll probably figure out some way to punish you. It's just it is not categorically illegal to do it. Otherwise, there's all kinds of moils in town who have no medical training whatsoever who would be outside the law.
Is there a law in the United States against female genital?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
With their own consent after that.
Well, we have a federal law, chapter, what is it? I used to know the number up by heart. We clearly have a federal law against female genital mutilation. And it has been made extraterritorial. In other words, if you're a Somali parents who are really keen on this, and you want to fly to Mogadishu and get some midwife, they're called, to do this, when you come back, you'll get arrested. So, I tell you, the big dampener in the Somali community, and I did this research for my presentation in England, is that they worry about being deported. So the fact that they're here and they want to stay here is a huge motive not to cut their daughters, which is fine with me. You mean, what are you saying? You mean if you want to do a tonsillectomy in your basement? Well, that's practicing medicine without a license. But the thing is, you can practice, nurses can do circumcisions, LPNs can do circumcisions, midwives can do circumcisions. There's no law against it. It's amazingly wide open field. You can just, I've often threatened, in fact, I had a joke brochure years ago about renting an office right across from Children's Hospital and putting up a big billboard that says discount circumcisions, $37.50. We'll meet any competitor's price. I never did it because it was just a thought. Yeah.
You mentioned early on went through some of the religions, and my understanding is that female genital mutilation did not start in Islam; it started in Africa and was imported.
Yeah. I think I think the traditions melded, and now what you get is people who do it saying, "Oh, it's done for religious reasons." But there are animists, African animists, who believe in female circumcision because it will guarantee better crops, and the spring rains will come, and etc. So I mean, but see that's. I wouldn't argue with that. By the way, I forgot to show you. Well, there's a Europe in November. We'll make this real fast because I think we might have to cut it off. But in September, yeah, right. Sorry about that. In September 2012, the American Academy of Pediatrics came out with a statement that said they thought that circumcision was worth the risk, even though they have never been any studies about what the risk really is. And so they said that it should be paid for out of the public funds. They said Medicaid should pay for it. Well, a group of Europeans, many of whom I know personally, and Michelle has met a few of the signers here, wrote a huge, long letter to the American Academy of Pediatrics, which they at least had the decency to publish, saying there was cultural bias because they were Americans. Let me tell you the cultural bias. There were 8 people on the committee. One circumcised his own son on his kitchen table. One promoted female, from this, I won't mention his name, because I have no interest in talking to his lawyers for the next 2 weeks. A doctor here at Children's Hospital was the one who promoted female genital cutting, so we know what he thinks of circumcision generally. One was a lady who refused, who was the head of the health department in New York, who refused to rein in a mohel who was giving infants herpes. Now the thing about herpes as an adult is it's a nuisance, but it can be controlled. For an infant, it's a death sentence because they don't have the immune system to fight it off, so they get brain damage or they die. So I mean, that's 3 out of 8. Another one was an expert on medical financing, no knowledge whatsoever of whether this procedure is any good. So that's 4 out of 8 on a committee that decided that circumcision was a great idea. So, yeah, well, of course, yeah. And by the way, this is what kids look like if you forcibly retract them. I won't keep that up there for long. Yeah. Oh, really? Oh, good, yeah. And if anybody's interested in other information on this, feel free to email me. You wouldn't believe I was on my hard drive after 12 years.
Well, I'm just curious if there's any institutional policies amongst various medical groups in this area. Like does Group Health or does the University of Washington or Providence Hospital have any published guidelines to what they do? Or what they recommend?
What happens? Well, I can tell you that almost everybody in this community and in many other medical communities have a very parent-centered view of this whole thing. Right. They say we want to respect parents' cultural traditions, we want to not hurt people's feelings, respect their religious traditions. They always chuck in their religion, even though it's like, as I already told you, 1 in 1,000. But they try and lard it up with all that stuff, and they say, well, it's your option, you cannot do it, but We have a campaign called Don't Ask, Don't Sell, which we're trying to sell, literally. And that's how New Zealand solved the problem. The doctors in the 1960s got together and said, let's not even talk about it. And when they ask, let's say it's obsolete and came from Britain. There's nothing Kiwis like to hear about dumping something that it came from Britain.
None of them have a principled stand on it, though, that agrees with your views.
No.
One more question.
No one is that brave.
So in New Zealand, are there Jewish people?
Yeah, and there's not a single mohel in the whole country.
And they're not circumcised?
No, they hire a mohel, you fly them in from Australia if you can afford it.
So very few are? Or all?
Well, first of all, New Zealand doesn't have a large Jewish community. Okay. And many of them are not, most of them would be secularized. So we're only talking about a tiny segment of a tiny segment of a tiny segment. And so if they want to spend $5,000 to fly in a moil, they do.
I had a girl in my group whose husband was a Jewish person from Britain.
Mm-hmm.
He was not circumcised, and she contends that most Jews in Britain are not circumcised.
I really don't know. I can tell you that most of the Jews in South America are not, and most of the Jews in Spain are not. So
we actually need to.
we got to wrap it up.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Can I do machinery while you're? Oh man, like it's so yucky. It's called we call it MBP. It's Metsitsa Bipe, suction by mouth. And what the moil does is when the child's bleeding, he sucks the child's penis, and which is a great way to get a disease. That I alluded earlier to it when I said that Christianity in the Middle Ages had been anti-Semitic, because they turned that practice into claiming that Jews ate human flesh, and that they captured Christian boys and sucked the blood through their penis, and that's called the big libel, the great libel, because it was a way to be anti-Semitic, claiming, jacking up the horror of this particular practice, which I claim is correct. Yeah. Well, and frankly, I don't know my types. I don't know which is, must be oral, huh?
Where it's located, it could just be one or two locations.
Right.
But an initial infection of herpes can be devastating.
For an infant, yeah. And there's a whole bunch of kids in New York who are dead. And Bloomberg refuses to do anything about it.
The parents will not reveal the name of the moil.
Correct. Yeah. And I mean, that community is very isolated, very small. And I belong to that segment of my group that says, let's not go there. It is so small. It is so yucky. Let's just move on with the main issue and try not to get involved in these little weird thingies that makes you seem horrible. I mean, I've been called anti-Semitic so many times it doesn't even matter anymore. I don't think about it. I just, what can I do?
Thank you so much.
Cheers. Yeah. Thank you.